Hello, all, and welcome to the World Discord podcast. My name is Brian Endless. I'm here with my co-host, Joel Ostrow. And we have a special guest today who Joel will introduce in just a moment. Today, we're going to talk about Iran, and we're going to start with the death of the president and foreign minister in a helicopter crash on May 19th. This seems to be an accident. At least that's what the Iranian government is telling us. It was a technical failure. This may, though, have ramifications not just for Iran, but for the Middle East, for the United States, and the world. President Ibrahim Raisi was described as a hardline Shiite cleric and a protege of Iran's supreme leader, as well as a possible successor to that post. For those who don't know Iran, the president is second in power after the supreme leader, but the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is also very important in political calculations. For this president, his term was noticeable for the crackdown on the women's uprising in 2022 and for the direct attack on Israel this year, among other things. Current issues that might be affected by his death, the relations between Iran and Israel, potential for direct conflict, and Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, question of Iran and Saudi Arabia and Yemen, including Iranian support for the Houthi group, question of Iran and nuclear issues. The foreign minister had a lot to do with Iran's nuclear policy. And then there's also Iran and world relations with the United States, with Russia, and with China, among others. I'm going to turn it over to Joel now to introduce our guest, and then we'll get into the facts. Joel.
Thanks, Brian. We are fortunate to be joined today by Professor Kaveh Ehsani, who's Associate Professor of International Studies, and I believe the Associate Chair, correct, at DePaul University. Professor Ehsani has expertise in Iran, but also has done impressive work in international development and post-war reconstruction work. As I gather from your bio, you've done work for the UNDP and the World Bank and even FEMA at times. But we have invited Professor Ehsani to join us today to put into context the events of the weekend, the helicopter crash. And maybe, Kaveh, if you could just start off with telling us a little bit of background to the extent you can of who was on that helicopter and what they meant for Iran's government and what perhaps even was it unusual for so many high-ranking members of the government to be traveling together in that way? Maybe just start off with that to put this into context for us.
Sure. First, thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here. This was a short trip from the capital to the border between Iran and Azerbaijan, which is a very mountainous part of the Caucasus range. It's very mountainous. A river kind of divides, serves as border between Iran, Azerbaijan, but also Armenia. So they were co-constructing. Two dams have been co-constructed between the Republic of Azerbaijan and Iran. So the president of Azerbaijan and the Iranian president and the foreign minister, among many others, they traveled by helicopter to the border to kind of inaugurate this. And it was on the way back where, the weather was really foggy, his helicopter got disoriented and crashed. And then it became clear that, he had been killed along with the foreign minister. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, as usual, going around. The government of Iran is kind of claiming that this was a malfunction and an accident, not a pilot error or sabotage or anything like that. But that doesn't deter rumors from kind of circulating that Azerbaijan being pretty hostile to Iran, Iran having supported de facto Armenia and, being really kind of sensitive about the relations, the pan-Turkic relations between Azerbaijan and Turkey, the other neighbor on the west. And, there's been a lot of rivalry and, rhetorical criticism, separatism in Azerbaijan, northern provinces of Iran that border the Republic of Azerbaijan are kind of strengthening. I mean, there's a lot of discord and kind of unrest, in Azerbaijan, where nationalism and separatism are a factor, which make the regime really sensitive. But the important thing is also that Azerbaijan has been close allies with Israel. That has been very helpful in kind of setting up the security apparatus as well as the army, the military in Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan's kind of like assaults on Armenia, but also kind of like stirring up of kind of unrest in Iran's northern borders are also seen by the Iranian establishment as sort of being a byproduct of its alliance with Israel. So there's a strategic relationship that is, felt as being hostile, even though rhetorically, okay, we're neighbors, both are majority Shia, Muslim Shia populations, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of, under the surface, significant tension. So there's been the main rumor is that, if there was a sabotage, it has taken place by, Azeris or, by Israeli kind of allies and, agents uh, in Azerbaijan, but there's no evidence of that. So going back to your question, Joel, Iranian aircraft, including military as well as civilian, are extremely outdated because of sanctions. So all of Iran's fleet of civilian aircraft is basically dates to the 1970s or earlier. They were purchased from Boeing mainly, and neither spare parts nor kind of replacement aircraft have been available to Iran because of the sanctions, and this has even gotten much worse. So there's a very high record of crashes by civilian aircraft as well as military, and Iran's helicopter fleet is even more kind of dilapidated. So it was kind of a surprise that they traveled via these, 40-some-year-old helicopters. I'm not particularly surprised that the foreign minister and the president were traveling in the same, in the same convoy. There's nothing surprising about that. Like this kind of security consideration does not seem to be, have been much of a kind of a factor in the way that the Iranian political elite kind of operate, right? So that's not particularly surprising, but yeah, the kind of their loss is kind of an important moment in the life of Islamic Republic, although I don't think it's going to be that significant in terms of changing policies or anything like that.
Can you describe a little bit just the politics of the president and foreign minister, where they fit on the spectrum? I know Brian did, just sort of from your perspective. Is that an accurate depiction? And then maybe just a little, what's the process for the future? I know an interim president was named. Does that mean this person who is that person, and will that person automatically become the president?
There's Iran's politics is quite Byzantine. It's profoundly misunderstood, I think, abroad, not because it's kind of, indecipherable, but it's because, there's a lot of stereotype, floating about, I don't think there's no felt need that the system needs to be understood, instead of just kind of like pigeonholed as in Cold War terms. But so let me just kind of give an explanation. Maybe that helps. I mean, first of all, this establishment, this regime in Iran, is kind of like the consequence of a social revolution, a major social revolution in 1979. So it's not, I mean, the word revolution kind of is bandied about, especially across Middle East and elsewhere. And ordinarily, it kind of really is referring to coups d'etats by younger, military elites that kind of replaced the older one, kind of turned the state into some kind of a, apparatus of upward mobility for marginalized groups. This is the case in Syria. It has been the case in Iraq, in Egypt. Tunisia, and across many kind of cases. But the Iranian case was different because it came after a year of mass protest and a mass strike, a universal mass strike that brought down a very powerful state, the monarchy, right? So there's this kind of profound sense, at least until quite recently, that for better or for worse, this is a kind of a system that ordinary people put in power. People from the provinces, people from the lower classes, religious classes, traditionalists, so on and so forth. A huge coalition, but there was a huge participation as well. And then the war against Iraq, that lasted for 8 years throughout the 1980s, really kind of consolidated this feeling, even though it really kind of also polarized society because of all the cruelty, hardship. There was a civil war in Iran in 1980s, right? So the political system in Iran has been hybrid. It's from the onset. I mean, it's easy enough to kind of frame it as a theocracy. It's never been a theocracy. It's kind of portrayed as being a totalitarian regime. It's never been able to become like a Stalinist or a fascist regime. There's just like the whole apparatus of surveillance and kind of absolute control of populations has never been able to be put together because there's a lot of popular resistance. I mean, the Iranian population, the other side is, if you move away from the state, the Iranian population has been, on a regular basis, we've had like major popular uprisings. For economic reasons, for political reasons, students, workers, provincial people, uprisings about, the housing situation, irrigation and water, environmental crises, name it. There's an ongoing process, and often they get repressed quite brutally, but people are not scared, So if you have like that history of actually being empowered to change a whole political system that seemed absolutely massively powerful and kind of entrenched, that kind of empowers the population to kind of resist and not be intimidated, even though the situation is intimidating and the costs are very high, right? So from the onset, we've had a restive population that has not been kind of afraid to kind of voice its discontent, even though it's quite clearly, polarized and increasingly so along various kind of, disagreements and fissures and, and so on and so forth. And you've had a state that has been a dual state from the onset. I mean, there is a theocratic element, men of religion in positions of power, even though they're from a religious establishment, the Shia establishment, where kind of internal rivalry and disagreements is woven into it, I mean, there is no church in Islam, and especially in Shia Islam. But if you want to compare it to like Christian traditions, I mean, the Orthodox Church it's not a Catholic structure, it's an Orthodox structure, where you have multiple patriarchs that are kind of like elected by their supporters, supported. So they have grassroots, autonomous center, basis of power, so there's a lot of rivalry between and within the religious establishment, but also it has been an electoral presidency and a system. And even though, so it's been Republican and kind of theocratic simultaneously. It's never been democratic, but it has been Republican. So elections have always mattered on many levels, local, national, and so on and so forth, right?
And that's something, if I can jump in for a minute here, that's always fascinated me about Iran. It's a Republican democracy, obviously, but it looks from what I've seen that at the presidential level, local level, that it is actually very open in terms of elections, except for the fact that the people running for office have to be approved to run for office by the religious authorities. If maybe you could talk about that a little bit, but there are a lot of people contesting elections. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I to be clear, I didn't say it's a democracy. I said it's Republican. It's not democratic because it's not open elections, as you correctly pointed out. It's a highly kind of censored process of election because all candidates have to be approved by a non-elected body called the Guardian Council, that nominally basically evaluates whether they are loyal adherents of religion, of Islam, and the revolution. And because that's so arbitrary, any critique can be kind of sidelined, including former presidents. They've been disbarred President Rafsanjani, Khatami, Ahmadinejad. I mean, they couldn't stand even Rafsanjani, who was the most powerful man in the system, because there was this like one-sided institution of 12 men who basically could arbitrarily decide who can stand and who cannot stand. And there have been various elections, right? But the point is that elections mattered because even within this quite limited field of choices, people could find ways, various interests could find ways of expressing what they wanted, and candidates had to kind of respond to them, right? So this could be women, secular people, students, kind of workers, people from the provinces. The moments of elections were always these like wild, rare moments of wild freedom, where a lot of discussion would come out, and increasingly, especially throughout the 90s and early 2000s, people managed to kind of really force candidates to become responsive and become like the voices and stand in for, otherwise repressed demands, right? So this process has been kind of pretty much extinguished. So elections have become completely, by now they have become completely uncompetitive and quite restricted. Yeah. So, and this process started in 2005 in particular, with the elections in 2005, following George Bush's famous kind of, edict when before the invasion of Iraq that, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea are the axis of evil, uh, and basically kind of launched into a very kind of a deliberate regime change, policy towards obviously invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, two neighboring countries, but also Iran. So from then on, the kind of the military and conservative establishment decided that no matter what the cost, their survival was at stake, and they just kind of began to make elections at every level increasingly less competitive. So by now they're not. By now it's basically participation in elections, who can stand for a candidate. All of that has become virtually kind of a uncompetitive and chosen by the ruling establishment.
That's fascinating because I hadn't heard that idea before, that this was driven by Bush's axis of evil. Would you say that this was people inside who took advantage of the fact that Bush was speaking down to Iran and threatening Iran? Or do you think that this was something that was more natural and that arose from the way that the United States started treating Iran? And I'm not sure that there's that much different with those. But was this just kind of grasping elites who wanted to centralize power and took advantage, or was this more of a natural thing?
I would say a little bit of both. It's. I mean, let's remember that in 1997, Iranians elected a reformist candidate, right, with very open support by secular, urban, middle classes, and a whole array of coalition. I mean, like, Khatami in 1997 won something like 60,000, 20, 25 million votes, and of, 60, 70% of people who voted, and a very high percentage voted. So he had a very wide support, and the kind of conservative establishment was taken aback and wanted to kind of, were playing with the idea of like crushing, or like stepping in. And the then kind of still living senior figure, Ayatollah Rafsanjani, kind of stepped in and said, absolutely not, because we're going to undermine the entire legitimacy of the system. So, so we had a elected kind of a reformist, highly committed reformist parliament, as well as a president for 8 years, right? So there was a lot of internal tension. I mean, with the conservatives basically feeling kind of more and more encircled. It had become, through successive elections, it became clear that their support, people voting for them on a regular basis, never kind of went above 10, 12% of the electorate, right? Which is quite low, So it was very clear that people in the military didn't, or the, establishment, the conservative establishment did not have that much. They did have popular support, but not that much. So the hardcore was never more than 10, 12% of the population, right? But when in 2001, after 9/11, Iran basically approached the U.S. and gave them carte blanche to kind of attack the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan through Iranian airspace, and they said, "Yeah, we sympathize, we support you." And then Bush came out and said this, and then called them axis of evil and said, "Yeah, there can be no negotiation, and our policy, our no-conservative policy toward the region, is actual military regime change." Revived the whole kind of what happened in 1990 with the first Gulf War as a model to kind of pursue in the Middle East, and then proceeded and invaded Afghanistan, occupied Afghanistan, and then invaded and occupied Iraq at huge cost. I think the calculation among the conservative establishment in Iran was that, well, this is a game of survival,
And just to be clear for people who don't have a map in their heads as we do, that's surrounding Iran on the east and west sides.
Yeah.
That is effectively engulfing them. And interesting, too, you bring up here something that many people don't realize. The Taliban were the enemy of our enemy. The United States and Iran were on the same side in disliking the Taliban and their regime, and that was important at the time.
And same thing with Iraq. I mean, Iraq had invaded Iran, so, but if you look at the map, you're correct that if you look at the map, I mean, Iran is surrounded by U.S. military bases, or, in Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, in Bahrain, in Qatar. In Iraq, there's direct military presence. Afghanistan was like this. Azerbaijan, as we mentioned, that, so there is a, Pakistan, the other neighbor. I mean, so there's a kind of like this profound sense of insecurity based on this whole like 30, 40 years of warfare. So the justification for the conservative establishment is that in Iran is that this is a game of survival, that we can't negotiate with people we can't trust, that they cannot be trusted, and their aim is to kind of undermine us from within or with threats from outside. So this is the calculation that's going on in that establishment, and kind of narrowing down elections and basically doing away with the whole legitimacy of republicanism has been a price that they have been willing to pay, because they think it's an existential situation.
So is it then inaccurate? Like when I listen to media reports, even over the weekend and after the crash, we still hear descriptions of a sort of reformist conservative continuum among leading Iranian politicians, and that so these incumbents were described as harshly conservative loyalists, and I still wonder, is that accurate, or is that accurate for really all potential occupants of such high level positions? And then I do have a sort of follow up that would connect to that. But I'm curious about that. Is there really no reformist movement that can compete for power anymore? Not that is allowed to compete. That's what I'm.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in the past 5-6 years, we've had at least 3 major popular uprisings across the country. And they have been kind of sustained, especially in 2022, 23, the so-called women's movement. But it was much more than that, in urban areas, especially, among the more secular middle classes, the women's aspect was really kind of pronounced, but it kind of also tied with, workers' protests, environmental issues, and especially minorities, second-class minorities kind of objecting to that, right? So there's this huge upswell of pressure from below, against the establishment that has, very much been there. This is kind of like seconded by the huge impact of the sanctions, economic sanctions, that have led to hyperinflation and the kind of collapse of currency. In Iran, there's a daily, revelations of massive corruption among the ruling elite, which kind of also, for a regime that kind of claims to be moral, to be kind of found out to be profoundly amoral and corrupt, is a huge blow to its legitimacy, right? So there's like this combination of internal, mounting crises and also external threats that have to be kind of managed by a increasingly narrowed down and hardcore, conservative establishment. So, part of that has been to kind of push out, put under arrest, deny the possibility of mounting, standing in for office by rival candidates, and kind of imprisoning people on a massive scale. I mean, I know, for example, I worked as an editor of a journal in Iran, co-editor on an editorial board, and within the whole press and like independent press and media sphere, the fact that any journal, any publisher, any newspaper that that is not kind of towing the line it can no longer get any subsidies, like cheaper paper, or some subsidies that everybody was given, like, so if you were a press, they would buy, the books that you publish would be pre-purchased, for libraries nationwide. All of that is gone, and given the huge economic crisis we're under, this means that the centers of opposition or kind of objection have been pauperized. People are kind of much more kind of engaged in mere struggle for survival, economic survival, than anything else. So there's a multi-layer strategy of sidelining and effectively silencing, impoverishing or imprisoning or repressing the opposition. Thousands of students, university students, have been let go. They've been expelled. Many, dozens, if not hundreds, of university professors who've been seen as critiques have been kind of disposed of. Many newspapers and journals are shutting down because they can't continue operating.
So accurate then to say, like, bottom line, you don't really see this having a potential for real political change internally, meaning that the death of the president, foreign minister, and others, that's whatever process happens to elect a new president or appoint a new president, that the odds of that leading to a more reformist direction are pretty minimal. Is that a fair?
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, unless we have a miracle and tomorrow there's a kind of a another nuclear accord, and a de facto peace is signed with I mean, there's a rapprochement with the Persian Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia and all that, under pressure from China primarily. But aside from that, the relations with Israel, with the United States, with EU, I mean, all of those are at a deadlock. The way that Iran has kind of sided with China and Russia, and so they've created a bloc, that are kind of lined up now in a kind of a hostile stance against the U.S. and the West. So that that avenue is blocked. So I don't think electorally anything will happen. That doesn't mean that the population is not restive or discontent.
Right.
I mean, it's remarkable that women, especially in larger cities, I mean, they have been so unbelievably courageous. I mean, they're just young women in particular. They just don't. Despite being repressed, they don't wear the hijab. They try not to. I mean, they can get, there's all these games you play, if you suddenly see the police, maybe you throw it on, but there's so much change at a social level and pushback, that is kind of much more brazen now. And I think anybody who had a lot of, still had any illusions and all that are, they've lost a lot of it, so, electoral politics, if they don't kind of miscount the votes, or kind of like actually report how many people will vote in 5 months time for the new president, as they should, I think the turnout will be incredibly low. And I think we'll know who the candidate is, who will get elected beforehand. So
let's maybe go to a few specific issues that are happening right now. I'd like to cover the big one first, which I actually don't think is Iran and Israel. I'd like to talk about Iran and nuclear policy for a minute, because that is always sitting behind us. I am a person who has followed this because I follow peace and security issues more than anything else. And in looking up Iran and nuclear policy, Iran has been accused since the early 1980s, or late 1980s actually, of coming close to a nuclear bomb. I think it was actually Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was first in parliament in the late 80s, early 90s in Israel, made the accusation that Iran is 2 years away from a bomb. And then others say 6 months away. And then the United States says 3 years away. And this has been going on now for 25 years.
Right.
That Iran is 6 months to 2 years away from a bomb. And then we have the current supreme leader who says that nuclear weapons are un-Islamic. Let's ask you, as an expert, where do you think Iran is at in terms of the potential to get nuclear weapons? What are some of the things from an Iranian perspective that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think both actually paradoxically are true. I mean, from the onset, this nuclear program was kind of developed to be one screwdriver away from having nuclear capability, right? Not having it, but then also having the potential. And again, the development of nuclear capability is directly linked to the sense of insecurity. I mean, it is it's seen by the regime, if it were to kind of reach that stage, as being a existential deterrent. I don't think any nuclear power actually develops nuclear weapons to drop them, because that will be the end of everything. It's a deterrence. Let's kind of,
And just to be clear here, that's a deterrent against both Israel and the United States,
anyway,
particularly.
well, I mean, I would even say this. I would say it's a deterrence against even internal enemies, because if a regime has nuclear weapons and they say, look, if we were to fall by an internal uprising or external kind of threat, then all these weaponry will fall into anybody's hand. And fragmentation is the most scary thing, right? Which is what we're seeing, for example, in Pakistan.
Yeah,
that despite all these disagreements with the US and the problems that the Pakistan military has, it's the institution that is seen as holding together, gluing together, Pakistan. And so it's kind of tolerated. And if anything, it has to stay there to kind of, prevent far worse alternatives. Same thing with the Iranian establishment. So yeah, it is a deterrence against external threats, but also kind of to make sure that even domestically they're kind of become secure. Now it's important to remember that until 2015, when Iran signed actually with the US the nuclear agreement, the International Atomic Energy Agency was regularly kind of visiting and monitoring the Iranian nuclear program, and they were in compliance, right? They never said that they're not in compliance.
Right.
The objection was that why did they start enrichment without kind of going through the process? And yes, they did that, secretly. When Trump basically scuttled unilaterally the agreement that the U.S. had signed with Iran, in exchange for lifting sanctions and kind of beginning to normalize relations, they said, all right, we're going to go back to enrichment. And even though they have been nominally engaged in negotiations, there have been a lot more kind of stonewalling, and chances are that they are kind of pursuing the potential development of nuclear weapons. Now we don't know how far that is. I mean, this week, the atomic inspectors are going to kind of visit Iran again, and let's see, what they will say. But I mean, technically, that's the issue. That can Iran develop these weapons or not? But the crux of the matter is political. The crux of the matter is not technical. It's not about Iran having this technology.
Right.
Other neighbors have it. Israel has it. Pakistan has it. Saudi Arabia is developing it. Right. This is horrible for everyone concerned. Right. But what is at the core of it is a profound sense of isolation and insecurity that is kind of motivating.
That characterizes how I've long viewed Iran, and President Biden was instrumental in the Obama administration in pushing for and keeping those the nuclear agreement negotiations going, and clearly regretted the United States abandoning that agreement. It was not Iran. You want to emphasize that Iran did not break the terms of the agreement. The United States pulled out. And now I see Iran as behaving quite rationally in saying no about starting them up, because the United States is the more unpredictable entity here. Iran, in this sense, is pretty stable. So I see Iran as the rational actor in that. And I've kind of seen Iran's foreign policy behavior as quite rational and predictable. Israel destroys a consulate of Iran's in Syria. In a sense, Iran has to respond. But how do they respond? They respond in a way that they know will protect what's most important, right? The regime itself. And so back channel communications, not only with the United States, but with the Saudis and the Emirates, like everybody knew when they were going to strike, what they were going to strike. And they even announced, this is the end of it as far as we're concerned. We're done launching stuff. That enabled, and they knew this would enable everyone to shoot down the drones and the rockets, because they knew when they were coming and where they were coming. And then, say, okay, that's it. We've done what we have to do. I see that as quite restrained in some ways, given the revolutionary rhetoric and how we cast Iran as this unpredictable and violent actor. I've seen their foreign policy as being quite predictable, and I wonder, do you see that as continuing, or is that at risk given what's happening?
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think this is the tragedy of, or the farce, of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, if you demonize the other side, and certainly the Iranian regime is, 10 times more of a culprit in this kind of rhetorical, politics of saying death to the U.S., death to Israel, if you're calling for somebody, demonizing your, opponent, then it becomes that much harder, to kind of come back to politics. But then both sides have been really, culprits in this. And yes, the U.S. has been. And, look, the response that came out that was, interesting, to the scuttling of the nuclear accord by Trump after, what was it, 2017?
Yeah.
The Iranian, then president and foreign minister Hassan Rouhani and Javad Zarif were trying to kind of continue those negotiations. And the response of the leader was that, well, what's the worth of this paper that they sign if then they say that the Congress doesn't approve it? We don't know who we are talking with. They can't deliver. This is not a system that can deliver, because there's so many kind of internal contradictions within the U.S. system that can't deliver actually what they sign on, that we can't depend on long term.
I want to reinforce this for just a minute, because for an American audience, I think this is an insanely important point. Most of the world, Iran included, now views the United States as the more unpredictable actor. And I think you're both saying that, and that is incredibly relevant to Iran and to every other issue. If Iran is being rational, I agree with both of you that I think they are, then the question is, what changes in the United States every election cycle? How do people know what rationality is and know what to expect? And we have to particularly look at that with someone who could be a violent adversary like Iran, where we have this history with them, that they may look at us as irrational. They may look at us as unreliable, and that's a pretty big thing to consider.
As a point to emphasize that, Brian, I had this immediate thought when I learned that the helicopter went down. And my first thought was, did Israel really have that, try to decapitate Iran's government? That was my first thought, because it seemed so plausible. And I thought, if Netanyahu and the Israeli foreign minister had been on a helicopter flying somewhere in Israel and it had gone down, the first thought would not have been that Iran took down that helicopter, because that would be something insane for Iran to do, and Iran knows that. And yet, had we learned that Israel did it, we're like, yeah, that checks out. Does that? I was wondering, like, did you think when you first heard it, did you think that that was possible? Now, what has Israel done?
Uh, yeah, it's not outside. Sadly, I mean, this is. I mean, like, just look at the past 5 years. Uh, you know, the U.S. killed the
Yeah,
chief of the Iran's
yeah,
military, Qasem Soleimani, in Iraq. Like you pointed out earlier, they bombed the Iranian consulate. They regularly kind of assassinate. They assassinated the head of the nuclear program, military nuclear program in Iran itself. So they're carrying out, openly games of assassination and elimination. So yeah, this wouldn't be beyond the realm of imaginable. Unfortunately, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's why the situation is such a tinderbox, because you have actors on various sides that really act with impunity. I mean, to me, it's actually quite remarkable what the United States is doing right now with the situation in Gaza. I mean, this is the international legal system that you have set up in the Second World War in order to be, these international laws, like the definitions of genocide, ethnic cleansing, the role of the UN, all of this was set up under U.S. hegemony to kind of make the U.S. the prime responsible for kind of maintaining this peace. So I think the entire world is looking at, for example, the situation in Gaza versus Ukraine and saying, look, these are like incredible double standards, that are so brazen. And U.S. is, because of this dysfunction within the U.S. foreign policy, the whole establishment, the whole like international law establishment is coming unstuck, because it's the whole, if the point is that the same rules don't apply to Israel, the same rules don't, and accountability doesn't apply to the US. You can do any of these things, assassinate people, invade, and so on and so forth, and then you kind of like rightly demonize Russia for invading, or Iran for kind of carrying out these kinds of act. Then I mean, like, what is the point of this system of legal system if it's taken for granted to be entirely one-sided and not apply to one side versus the other?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good opportunity to segue. We probably have time for one more topic here. Let's talk about Gaza and Israel, and talk about it from Iran's side, because that's one that we don't see very much in the news. When we see it, it's Iran supports this group or Iran supports that group. Maybe you can talk to us and provide a little more detail, both on Iran's role in Israel and in the Gaza conflict in particular, but also something that we never think about, which is, what are Iran's goals
right.
here toward Israel? What should we really be looking for Iran's goals?
uh, First of all, I mean, I think that, yeah, Iran has alliances with proxies in the region, but like the portrayal of, for example, Hamas being a extension of Iranian foreign policy is nonsense, including even Hezbollah. There are alliances that are calculated by both sides, and kind of supported by both sides. But that doesn't mean that the Iran's proxy allies, the Houthi or the Hamas, don't have their autonomy and don't make their own policy choices. I mean, like the attack on Israel, I think it was completely kind of planned and carried out according to the military branch of Hamas, not even, I think, the political branch of it, right? And it kind of got out of hand the way it was carried out. It was supposed to be a military kind of assault, and then it became enraged assault also on civilians, right? So which kind of made it horrifying, even beyond that, right? But Iran's I think calculation is to again, goes back to the sense of existential kind of feeling of threat. So long as the main adversaries, the U.S. and Israel, continue to be tied up in conflicts away from Iranian borders, the Iranian establishment can say that, look, we're sticking to our principles, revolutionary principles of autonomy, anti-imperialism, and all that, and domestically we're secure. Look what's happening in Syria. Look what's happening in Egypt. Look what's happening elsewhere. In Lebanon, and we don't have terrorism here. We don't have fear of civilians being attacked. Of course, the crime is kind of increasing exponentially in Iran due to poverty and brutality of the state and all that, right? But they're correct that they've kind of maintained a relatively uh, quiet state of law and order as far as terrorist attacks are concerned. So that's part of the calculation for kind of working with proxies to maintain the security of Iran's borders and make sure that the adversaries are tied up elsewhere and pay a high cost. And if they decide to kind of invade Iran, then they'll increase the cost. So that's one thing. The second motivation, I think, is that, I mean, look, this is what is the Islamic Republic? What is it supposed to stand for? Right? I mean, this revolutionary notion of Islamism or Khomeinism, as I prefer to call it, because it's a doctrine that was kind of really formulated by that leader, and it has little to do with Islam or even the Shia establishment, right?
Very specific to him.
Yeah. I mean, it's a populism. It's a nationalist populism that is kind of like wants to create a Shia nation or Muslim nation. It's pan-Islamic, pan-Islamist. And as you say correctly, it was particular to him, and because he was the leader of such a successful movement that it's the one really successful radical Islamist movement that came to state power, undisputedly, and maintained it, right? So, but there, but by now, 40 years later, I mean, the whole ideas of social justice. I mean, Iran is the most unegalitarian society in the Middle East. Establishing a role of religious morality and all that. The corruption is rampant. I mean, it's remarkable, right? So there are like two or three slogans that remain that kind of continue to legitimize the whole revolution, quote unquote, revolutionary aspect of this regime. One is controlling the physical bodies of women and to a lesser extent men in public. The hijab issue, which is why it's so sensitive, and they just won't let go of this. And then kind of like this external enmity with the US and Israel. And as you said earlier, they've been willing to compromise on all of those things, right? I mean, remember, like when Khomeini was alive, they dealt with Israel, and the whole Iran Contra affair was Israel and the U.S. passing weapons to Iran, in exchange for their kind of for them giving money so that they could supply the Contras in Nicaragua, right? So they're quite pragmatic when it comes to this. But rhetorically, having this external enemy that is a kind of a vital enemy that that is has to be maintained no matter what is quite crucial. Will they change that rhetoric? I think if they can declare victory. I mean, I've written for 20 years about this, so I don't want to kind of repeat myself, but I think the like a lot of this has to do with symbolic politics. That the tone, the rhetoric, the approach, the behavior of of the adversaries has to change so that they can declare moral victory before they kind of try to normalize or accept to normalize things.
And I think that's something we have to remember. We do it too in the United States. Our dealings with Iran are really symbolic politics. I like that phrase. That's a great way to put it. It happens on both sides. We're far from innocent in this.
For sure. Well, I think that that will wrap up this episode. Professor Ehsani, thank you so much
My pleasure.
for providing the depth of knowledge and perspective that that I hopefully our listeners will gain from as much as I know I did, and assuming Brian did. It was really
I absolutely did.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and let's hope that cooler heads continue to prevail when it comes to Iran, the U.S., Israel, and that whole sort of nexus of conflict-ridden relations, because the possibility there for for at least peaceful coexistence certainly exists. That was demonstrated, I think, in the last decade, and let's hope that can come back. So, but thank you very much for your time and your
Thank you
knowledge.
very much.
As Jesse Jackson used to say, keep hope alive.
Keep hope alive. There you go.
A great closing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.